John Gotti. John Gotti died in prison in the year 2002 after serving about 10 years of a life sentence for, among other things, his convictions for 5 different murders. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family in the mafia. But before he died, while he was still in federal prison, one of the things that John Gotti got to enjoy as a feature of life in federal prison was that he had fairly regular visits with members of his family. And because those conversations were monitored by prison authorities, in his case, they were not just audio taped, they were videotaped. We can now, for the ages, see in living color, or at least in blurry, washed out, used to be color, not just the movie idea or the comic book idea of what gangsters are like. With the Gotti prison tapes, you can see the real deal. And he's exactly as charming as you might expect. In those same visits, which we have tapes of and transcripts of, we also know that John Gotti shared a vote of confidence in his daughter's husband. His own son-in-law, a guy named Carmine Agnello. Carmine Agnello himself was reportedly not able to visit John Gotti in person because of his own troubles with the criminal law. But that did not stop Gotti from telling his daughter what he thought about her husband on these same prison tapes. And I will spare you more of the tapes, in part because the bleeping gets exhausting. But on these same tapes, Gotti told his daughter about her husband, quote, "He's going to get indicted any day, this moron. Look, you want a prediction? By June, your husband's going to get indicted. And every 2-3 cents he's got, going to be all tied up." Gotti told his daughter about her husband, quote, "He's an imbecile." Then Gotti pretended to read a list of imaginary charges against his daughter's husband. Quote, "You got to see the charges: malicious mopery, possession of brain with intent to use, stolen bumper, hubcap." That was a reference to the fact that his daughter's husband was in the auto salvage and scrap metal business. So that was John Gotti saying, in essence, he'd get in trouble someday for a stolen bumper or a stolen hubcap. Gotti also referenced the fact that his son-in-law was thought to have some sort of mood disorder that resulted in violent rages and for which he took medications. Gotti said to his daughter in that prison visit in 1998 about her husband, he said, quote, "Is he feeling good? Is he not feeling good? Is his medication increase, decrease? Is it up, down? Does he get into the back seat of the car and think somebody has stolen the steering wheel?" Nice. Nice guy. Must be nice for the whole family. That was 1998, John Gotti, before he died a few years later in prison, berating his daughter about her then husband, his own son-in-law. But you know, in some ways, John Gotti was a little bit right, at least on one of those points, because those prison tapes were from 1998. The following year, in 1999, a new business opened up in Queens, New York, a new business called Stadium Scrap. It was called Stadium Scrap because it was right up near Shea Stadium, where the New York Mets used to play. And Stadium Scrap opened its doors in 1999, and they started buying up dead cars and putting them in the crusher, smashing them into hunks of metal, and then selling that metal to shredders and scrap dealers. And when Stadium Scrap opened up in 1999, it seemed like every other business of that kind in that part of Queens, New York. But if you looked super, super closely at Stadium Scrap, there was something about that business that was very different compared to other businesses of that type. Stadium Scrap, it turns out, had cameras everywhere and microphones. Quote, "A pan and tilt microwave camera was positioned on a pole approximately 100 yards from the entrance to the business. It viewed the front of the yard and most of the street. Additionally, a recording device was installed on the yard telephone, and a listening device was installed in the trailer that was used as an office there. They installed 2 video cameras inside the trailer and 1 outside the trailer overlooking the salvage yard." And these were not just the kinds of cameras that regular businesses set up for security purposes. These were cameras and microphones that were hidden, and they were monitored for surveillance purposes. Because Stadium Scrap, that business that opened up in Queens in 1999, Stadium Scrap, was fake. It was a big, long-running, undercover law enforcement operation. multiple law enforcement authorities got together and they hatched this plan that they would open up a fake business in Queens, a fake scrap metal and auto salvage business in that part of Queens. And they would do that basically as a sting operation because that business sector in that part of New York was generally believed by law enforcement to be all mobbed up. And so they thought they could use a fake business of that kind to try to crack open the organized crime infiltration of those businesses. So undercover law enforcement officers learned to drive wreckers and car crushers and forklifts and flatbed trucks and all the other stuff. They learned how to do this type of business. They opened up this fake business in early 1999, and they started doing the work. They were buying and selling scrapped autos and scrap metal. They're doing auto salvage. But bingo, as soon as they opened that thing up, instant results. Within a month of them opening up this fake business, Stadium Scrap, within a month of them opening it, in walked, as predicted by John Gotti, in walked John Gotti's son-in-law, Carmine Agnello, the guy who Gotti said was destined to be indicted any day now. According to state and federal prosecutors, this is what happened next. This is from the New York Daily News coverage at the time. Quote, Mr. Agnello and Joe Berger, a 390-pound childhood pal known as Jumbo, visited Stadium Scrap and told the undercover cops working there that Agnello wanted them to bring their metal to his business instead. This is from the New York Times coverage at the same time. Quote, law enforcement authorities said Agnello gave the officers a simple message: sell him the crushed cars at artificially low prices or suffer the consequences. Law enforcement officials said that when the undercover officers refused, Mr. Agnello had his associates firebomb the business, Stadium Scrap. And of course, because Stadium Scrap was fake, because it was an undercover law enforcement operation set up specifically to catch criminals, there were cameras and microphones everywhere that caught all of that. So they were able to lay it all out in the indictment and in the press releases they were very proudly able to soon put out about the indictments that derived from that case. Quote, on the night of June 10th, at the direction of Agnello, the lock on Stadium Scrap's gate was cut. On June 15th, Agnello directed the firebombing of Stadium Scrap's office trailer and a flatbed truck. At 2 a.m. on June 17th, at Agnello's express direction, Stadium Scrap's gate lock was cut, its yard was entered, glass bottles filled with gasoline were thrown, and a flatbed truck and the gasoline was ignited with road flares. On June 29th, at 1 a.m., at Agnello's express direction, Stadium's gate lock was again cut. Gasoline was thrown on the steps of the trailer office and on the trailer itself, and the gasoline was ignited. On June 30th, Agnello had Berger, remember Jumbo's last name is Berger, so technically he's Jumbo Berger. Agnello had Jumbo, Mr. Berger, inspect the damage caused by the fire the night before, which Mr. Berger shortly thereafter was observed doing. So this bust, this long-time undercover sting operation involving the cops running a fake scrap metal and auto salvage business in Queens, they got a bunch of press for it at the time. I think in part because of the cinematic nature of this law enforcement operation, honestly, but also because it did not take them long to catch a big fish. I mean, they got Gotti's son-in-law, who it turns out is not a guy who was just looked upon with disfavor by his famous father-in-law in prison. According to the Daily News at the time, Agnello was viewed as a, quote, real-life Tony Soprano, a ruthless 250-pound mobster who also controlled highly profitable, legitimate businesses. Over the years, Agnello has scuffled with cops writing him traffic tickets. He was accused of beating an ex-employee with a telephone. Prosecutors say he threatened to break the fingers of a debt collector and put him in the trunk of a car. The indictment says Agnello threatened to hit a stockbroker with a hammer. But when they snapped the trap shut on this sting operation, this Agnello guy, for all his charms, he was not the only guy they caught. In the initial indictment, Agnello and 3 other guys were charged under the state's Organized Crime Control Act. But by the time they wrapped up the operation the following year, it wasn't just him and a handful of guys who were in his crew. By the time they wrapped this up the following year, there were 49 people who got arrested in this sting. So yeah, this got a bunch of press coverage. There were definitely bragging rights involved for the prosecutors here when these indictments came down. But looking back on it now, what seems particularly interesting for us now is that it wasn't only the prosecutors who had bragging rights about that sting. Now, as I mentioned, this was a joint law enforcement operation, and it involved a whole bunch of different law enforcement entities, including NYPD and prosecutors in Queens. It also involved another agency whose annual report that year actually contained some of the juiciest details we got about this whole operation. And that entity, which was a key part of this sting operation, was the fraud squad at the New York State Insurance Department. And the New York State Insurance Department doesn't have that name anymore. That insurance department has now been incorporated into an agency called the New York Department of Financial Services. But it still does the same work, and they've still got the same law enforcement responsibilities. And I'm sure, because they do criminal insurance enforcement, I am sure a bunch of that is as boring as it sounds. But sometimes, in the relatively recent history of that agency, it has been the opposite of boring. It's been front page news for many days running. It's been dudes learning to run auto crushers, opening up fake scrap metal businesses in Queens next to Shea Stadium, and then getting firebombed by dudes named Jumbo who threatened to snap off people's fingers and shove them into trunks. I mean, it has involved operations that wrapped up 50 suspected gangsters at a time, including proving John Gotti right about the propensity of his son-in-law and crime family associate for getting indicted sometime soon, in part because of his volcanic and uncontrollably violent temper. And that is the same agency, the exact same agency, that has now subpoenaed the insurance broker that has done business for years with the President of the United States and his business.